So responsibility for promoting, explaining or even contesting a budget doesn't rest entirely with the leaders, the treasurer, the shadow treasurer. It's actually a full team effort. So we're going to check in now with two frontbenchers who'll also put their shoulders to the wheel in their respective causes. Jane Prentice is an Assistant Minister for Social Services and Disability, and Claire O'Neil is Shadow Justice for Labor. So starting first of all, I suppose, with where the Treasurer left off there, Jane Prentice, clearing the decks of these zombie measures, he's really calling out to the Parliament to move on from the fighting of the last 3 years. From your knowledge of politics, is that going to occur?
Yes, I think it will. I mean, we've put out a budget that I think's about opportunity, jobs. There are a lot of jobs involved through the infrastructure projects, and I think it's a budget that takes us forward into the future. It's set out very clearly in the pathway to a surplus in 2021. And through that, we've got the infrastructure, we've got big ticket items like the Snowy Hydro, the Inland Rail, major efforts in the capital cities. That all delivers jobs. And that goes hand in hand with other things such as the trade agreements, which are starting to kick in with growth in our exports. There's opportunities for people. And it's a good news budget. All
right. Well, Claire, politics has been at loggerheads on some really big issues since 2014. Clearing out $13 billion worth of zombie measures, is there at least ground now for some meeting in the middle?
Well, I think it's important to note that not all the zombie measures have come out of the budget, Greg. So one of the ones that remains, for example, is the increase to the pension age to 70, and there are several others that still remain in the budget. The critical point, though, is that those zombie measures were offensive to Labor and offensive to Australians because they were fundamentally unfair. And that critical unfairness still remains in this budget. This is a budget that is raising taxes on ordinary Australians in order to give tax cuts to the big banks and tax cuts to the biggest multinationals in this country. It cuts funding to schools. It doesn't do anything to protect Australians and their healthcare. So I just argue that although some specific measures have been taken away, that unfairness still remains the centrepiece.
So when you talk about tax increases, you're obviously including there the increase in the Medicare levy, which the government says is purely to fund the gap with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I take it you don't buy that, but more importantly, what's the alternative? Where is NDIS left if that funding gap is not addressed by additional revenue?
Yeah. Well, I was interested to see in Scott Morrison's address, he spent a good 10 minutes, I think, talking about the NDIS as though it was his idea. This is a Labor initiative. It's something that needs to be executed on by a Labor government because, frankly, I don't think the Liberals' hearts are in it. And I think that's reflected with this ongoing conversation about the funding of this scheme. This scheme was fully funded from day naught. The 2013-14 budget shows clearly how the funding was going to be rolled out for the scheme.
All the way through to 2027.
That's exactly right, Greg. It's in the 2013-14 budget papers. But I'll just say, let's remember in the context of all these conversations about what can and can't be afforded in the budget, that this is a government that's found room to give a $50 billion tax cut to the biggest companies in this country.
Yeah. Jane, this is actually in your portfolio area,
so
your head's probably full of the numbers. Can I just ask you, as a Liberal, was it confronting to have to come to a landing point on this where tax increases were the answer? Because this wasn't in the Liberal script as recently as 2 or 3 years ago.
And as you know, we put up many opportunities for savings because we wanted to be able to fund NDIS through savings, not through tax. But at the end of the day, the Liberal Party, the coalition, was always committed to fully funding NDIS, but we hadn't settled on how. We set up our independent savings fund so that we quarantined funding, and once again, that's where what Labor failed to do. They sort of pointed at sort of pigs flying in the sky and saying, oh, we're going to pick that little bit of savings, but it never went into a fund for NDIS, and that money was actually used more times than once to fund various promises. And in fact, if you look at the estimates from that budget, the Treasury officials admit that there is no evidence of where NDIS could be funded from. The Liberals were always, the coalition was always committed to funding NDIS, but we hadn't settled on how. So to give people certainty, and we're dealing with people here with disability, the most vulnerable in our community, and we wanted to give them certainty that the funding would be secure, and that's why we've gone to this levy to make sure that people out there know not only are we committed, but the funding's secure, it's going to be quarantined, and they can rely on the fact that they or their children with disability will be cared for.
So noting your argument, Claire, that it's Labor's firm belief that it was fully funded. Can I ask you about the principle, though, that's been espoused by the Treasurer there? He's spoken about chipping in for this compassionate cause, appealing to the idea that Australians would find generally acceptable a tax increase when it's put to a good purpose. Do you broadly buy that argument? Do you think Australians are on that page?
Greg, I do, and we know that they are because they already have paid a tax increase to partly fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Remember, part of the most substantial single piece of funding that Labor put in place for the National Disability Insurance Scheme was an increase to the Medicare levy. Now, what we're saying is, why is the government prioritising giving a tax cut to the biggest businesses in the country and yet crying poor when it comes to the NDIS? So I just want to make sure your viewers understand what's going on here. The central mission of this budget is to increase taxes for ordinary Australians and cut taxes for millionaires and multinationals. That's really what's happening.
This is an argument that's raged since this time last year. Jane, are you prepared to weather this
Not at
constant
all.
argument
No, Greg,
around the corporate
clearly the
tax?
budget is about jobs. It's about opportunities and it's about jobs. And that's what we're trying to create, whether it's through tax cuts, which will create more jobs, whether it's through our infrastructure plan, which will create more jobs. So you've got the expenditure which we need to support people in education, in welfare, and all those budgets are increasing, or you've got the infrastructure plans which will deliver major infrastructure for Australia, but more importantly, jobs and growth, particularly for regional Australia. It's very important that we don't think about the capital cities in Southeast Australia. We need to think about our regional areas.
Sure. Let's move on to something where I think there is agreement, or there appears to be, which is the bank levy, $6 billion worth. No hesitation around this from Labor's point of view, it appears. Claire, even in the face of bank retaliation, what do you think voters will think of banks who seek to pass on, whether to shareholders or to
I think
customers?
they're going to be incredibly annoyed about it, as Labor will be. And I have to say, I think that, past behaviour of the bank suggests that they're probably just going to pass this on to consumers. Now, that's going to be a slap in the face to all Australians, basically.
But do you think they should go ahead, Parliament should go ahead and do it anyway?
I do. I think this is a measure that's going to go some way to correcting some of the issues that we see. But it's important to note, Greg, that this is not going to get to the heart of what is the problem with the banks. And this is a very important smoke and mirrors routine on behalf of Malcolm Turnbull, who's doing everything he can to help the banks avoid a royal commission. We know there are significant cultural problems within this sector. The only way to address them is through a banking royal commission. So we're happy to support this levy that's going to be charged to the banks, but we need to go a lot further, and the vast majority of Australians agree with that principle.
So even, Jane, with the cover of Labor's support, you must have a plan for some blowback directed against the government, not just the Parliament, but the government, by the banks.
Well, equally, as Claire said, we'd be very disappointed if the banks passed it on. They've got no need to whatsoever. The top 5 banks are making a profit of $30 billion a year at the moment. Their CEOs are being paid $12 million and upwards, some of them. So there's absolutely no excuse for passing it on.
But Jane, you do agree that they probably will pass it on, don't you?
Well, I understand today that they've suggested that one of them has suggested they will. We've got to look at the fact that the levy's not on their liabilities. It's not on investment accounts and deposit accounts by their customers. But of course, customers can change banks if they want to. Equally, though, the government has funded more money into the ACCC to look at bank behaviour and has set up bodies to make sure that the banks are more transparent in their behaviour. But I hope that public opinion will force the banks not to pass it on, because there's no need for them to do so.
Is there a bit of post-Trump, post-Brexit thinking at large in the coalition on this now? Because it wouldn't have been considered traditional Liberal policy until, well, in fact, you argued against some of this stuff all the way up until this budget.
Well,
we've
got 2 things that are happening. We've got a Senate, and we've been given a Senate by the people of Australia. But the Senate is a complex body these days. It's not just Liberal and Labor. There's a whole lot of other parties as well. And the bottom line with the Senate is that they won't automatically pass the government's policies, and neither they need to, but gone are the days when you had a majority in both the House and the Senate. So we have that challenge. We've had $13 billion of savings rejected by the Senate. So we need to look at other ways because we do need to get back into a surplus budget.
Okay.
And so that's why we need to go down this path.
All right, just finally on a values proposition, I suppose there's a strong welfare compliance measure in this budget, including penalties for job seekers who don't show up for interviews, some drug testing trial. What do you think about squeezing this lemon? There is a balance, isn't there, between money well spent on the welfare budget versus getting too hard against those in difficult circumstances?
Well, I mean, I just speak from a personal point of view because we're still digesting some of these policies, but I just think it's pathetic that whatever opportunity there is, the government goes after the people who have the least and then finds a way to give the people who have the most an easy ride. And I think this is just more of the same. Like, why are we focusing on these people? They're you know, to the extent that people are badly behaved and on welfare, it's a really small part of the overall problem of the budget. It's nowhere near, for example, the $50 billion that the government's going to splash around the biggest businesses in this country. So I've got an issue with it. And I'll just make the point as well, Greg, I think there are very well evidenced connections between things like homelessness and substance abuse and mental illness. And here we have a government that's, you know, telling us it's doing all these fantastic things for people who are homeless and mentally ill. Yet when it comes to welfare and drug dependency, they're, you know, bringing out the big hammer. And I just think there's not a consistent message here.
And Jane, just wrapping that up, are you comfortable with
No,
these
no,
measures?
because when you look into the detail, what you find is there's no cut in the budget. The welfare budget stays the same or increases. It's trying to identify and help these people. And that's what we're about, is trying to simplify it for them, to help them and support them. Because at the end of the day, most people want a job. They're getting payments from taxes. That's Australian taxpayers' hard-earned money. But we need to make sure it's going in the right way to help people in the right way. If they have a substance abuse problem, we need to help them. It shouldn't just be, oh, let them stay on the job support program. We need to move them into one of our programs to help them recover.
Well, instead of taking away their income, I just suggest something like rehab beds might be a better space to go to if you're really concerned about
we've
people with
increased
a
money for
substance abuse
homelessness and those other areas.
Yeah,
And
well, you're
there's
going to have
plenty.
to, because that's what these reforms will ultimately lead to.
All right. Well, look, on that note, I do have one eye on the clock, on your behalf, in fact, because
Thank
you
you,
do have to
Greg.
make it to the House of Representatives for question time. So Jane Prentice and Claire O'Neill,
Good to
thanks
talk.
for your thoughts
Thanks,
on
Jane. Thanks, Greg.
this
Thanks,
budget
Greg.
one
Thanks,
day.